All right, so I'm going to introduce our speaker now. This is Marne Kaeske, right? Okay. Is the Cultural Preservation Specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority, an intertribal natural resource management agency protecting and implementing the off-reservation harvest for the Bois, Forte, and Grand Portage bands on ceded lands in the Arrowhead region of present-day Minnesota. That was a long sentence. She developed an intrigue for usufructuary treaty rights. Okay. History of Falsely as an undergrad at UWM, majoring in American Indian Studies and CES. Marne is fortunate to have had the opportunity to build 1854's Education and Outreach Division from its inception. So now I'm going to introduce Marne. How are you? How are you?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thanks. Yeah, keep calling, you to pass these.
I think I know one of you in the room right now. Other than that, I don't think I know anybody, so, who's you? Marne Kaeske, County na Dodo Damascene, Onagamin Singata, Giduzi Needs and Yujiva. Jagana Shikwe, 1854 Treaty Authority, Nidanoki. Which me. We have any speakers here? Going? Okay. So thank you guys for inviting me to speak with you today. As they mentioned, yes, the 1854 Treaty Authority is an intertribal natural resource management agency. We work for both the Grand Portage Band and the Bois Forte Band, like Spirit Chippewa, and we are tasked with two things. Thank you. One is protection of treaty rights harvest and protection of those resources. The second would be implementation, making sure that we can provide a program for our constituency to actually get out and hunt and fish and gather. And where do we work? Within the lands that were ceded to the United States government or handed over. All of present day northeastern Minnesota, Arrowhead region, and the Iron Range. And maybe I got a map here for you. Here we are. Everything inside this yellow line is the 1854 ceded territory or treaty area, if you will. You guys live here. What do you know about this area?
Nothing.
Nada? Newbie here? All right.
Lots of woods and lakes.
That's what we're saying, right? It's great. I do like to do a little bit more participatory back and forth. I understand some of your mouths are full right now, so I understand if you can't provide any back and forth for me. That's cool. What does the ceded territory have? Well, it's covers about 6 counties, Cook and Lake County in total, most of St. Louis County and Carlton County, and a little piece of Pine and Aiken County. It's got 3 Indian reservations, Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, and the Vermilion Tract of the Bois Forte Reservation System resides within. It's got a ton of state parks and state lands, county lands. And most profoundly, I think, is the fact that we have federal public lands here. We have Superior National Forest and the Boundary Waters Community Area Wilderness, which makes up about 45% of the lands within the ceded territory. So all in all, it's about 5.5 million acres large. When we talk about who 1854 Treaty Authority is, I like to do a little comparison to maybe other natural resource management agencies that you know of. Does anybody have any ideas of other natural resource management agencies that we might be able to compare and contrast?
Forest Service, the DNR.
Yeah.
Lithwick.
Yeah. Yes. I'd like to start with talking about where most folks in the area go to purchase their license for fishing. For instance, Department of Natural Resources, they do a lot of great stuff. They work for the people of Minnesota at large. They work in environmental, they work in parks and rec. They work to make sure that there's boat ramps in place in our many vast lakes, so we can, I think, take my family fishing and access these. Comparatively, as you mentioned, thinking larger, right? I like to talk about Fish and Wildlife Service. I have a little bit more experience working with them than I do National, Forest Service, but these guys work all over the US, right? They're tasked with helping out plants and animal species that aren't doing so well, what we call threatened and endangered species. So compared to that, 1854 Treaty Authority, we work for Bois, Forte, and Portage fans and their constituency, their enrollees. And where do we work? All within the 1854 ceded territory. And what we're tasked with is really maintaining a food source, if you will, a way of life. So our story really starts thousands and thousands of years ago, when the way of life was determined by the season. It marked what one would be doing or should be doing, right? Give you an example, where are we on this part right here? Well, ice was off a couple weeks ago, so we'd be cruising around in our G-Man. There's no roadways around the area, so we'd be using our waterways as little water highways. At the end of the summer, which happens to be too quick every year, we're harvesting Monoma. It's the Monoma Kaeske, it's the wild ricing moon. And then 13 months of winter, of course, we can't go out for pizza, we have to go catch our dinner. So we head out to the dark house on the lakes. And then at the end of a long, long winter, we gather in small groupings in the sugar bush. The the sugaring one, the boiling down one. And that was a really important time for people to get back together again, but also to remember those folks that didn't make it through the winter. So all of these activities and more are things that are still happening in this area. And we're really fortunate that we can continue to do these things. We can canoe, we can wild rice, we can fish, we can sugar. And it's part of everybody's heritage that lives here. Everybody's communal resources. So I'm gonna change directions here. What's a treaty?
Agreement between two sovereign nations.
Awesome. It sure is. I got goodies too, so I'm gonna give those away. I'm sorry for everybody who's on Zoom. I can't give you anything. Yeah, a treaty is an agreement between two or more parties, and they go to. There's lots of reasons that people are making treaties and signing treaty agreements. Now, probably the most renowned treaty in US history is the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. That treaty did two things. Any history buffs in here know what that treaty did? Yep, that's one thing. What's the other thing it did?
The land.
Close. That's usually the second guess I get, but it's not right. As far as I know, but I have the microphone, so it could be wrong. Who said that? Revolutionary. Good job. And also declared American independence from Great Britain. So too many things, right? What is a treaty? What is a treaty? Treaty of Paris. The US is still signing treaties with foreign nations today. 2022, there are about 36 treaties agreed upon, mostly between like tariffs and taxing and things of trade. But treaties can be about peace. They can be about land transfer. They can be about what else? The ideas.
Great trade agreements.
Trade agreements, right? They're very living and binding covenants. If you think of that Treaty of Paris, that agreement with Great Britain, it's very hard to go back on, to do away with, if you think about it. It creates a foundation. It's like a marriage, right? And you build upon that. So they're very profound agreements and turning points in our history. All right, who knows what sovereignty is?
Sovereign government. So it's the government that rules over people, land. Sovereignty.
Close.
Will you please repeat it?
Sure, I'm sorry. Yes.
No way I can speak louder and just talk about it. I don't wanna like.
No, you're good. I'll turn the volume up.
What is sovereignty? Does anyone know what sovereignty is? Yeah,
Sovereign originally was a king or a ruler, someone whose word was absolute the final word. Sovereignty in the modern world is that principle of a state or government above which there is no others.
right.
Absolute independence.
Independence, self-ruling, exactly. I'm afraid to walk over there and give you your gift because I don't want this thing to squelch. Could you help me?
Yeah.
I got people now. Yes. Thank you. Very much. Sovereignty, right? It's self-rule. And the fact that the treaty we're talking about today, the 1854 treaty, the fact that the United States government approached those sovereign nations of indigenous folks in this area recognize their sovereign rule, their independence as a people. So here's where I kind of break down a short history of how this 1854 treaty came about. It was the mid-1800s. And the United States is really interested in expanding into these lands. There's a lot of good mineral resources. Certainly there's enough timber. And there's a lot of interest from settlement, farming, bringing this land into taxation. There are lots of folks that were invested in an economy that had been going on for about 150 years before this time. Does anybody know what economy that was? It brought a lot of different people from different countries all over the world. Yes, okay. I don't have enough goodies for all of you guys to hand them out all right now, but you know what? I think I brought enough for everybody, so I'm gonna put them in the back of the room at the end, and y'all can take some goodies. Also, some publications too, if you'd like learn a little bit more about what some of the things we're talking about today. So there's a lot of expansion needs, right? These weren't vacant lands because of that fur trade. There's lots of different folks from different backgrounds participating in that. And probably the keystone were the indigenous folks. And so the way that the United States was handling diplomacy at the time with American Indian peoples was through treaty making. US government said you have to go about by a treaty agreement to do any sort of work. And so United States government leadership met at the spot that they did most of their diplomacy, which was La Pointe on Madeline Island in Lake Superior, just outside of Bayfield. And those leaders said, hey, indigenous leaders, we got a deal for you. If you agree to hand over your land, we'll make sure to provide a place for you and your families, you and your communities to live forevermore. What were those called? Aye, aye. Miigwech. Yes, reservations. But they also threw in some goods and services and some money to be given to them on an annual basis called annuity payments. And without mentioning blackmail, coercion, lack of translation, an appropriate and adequate translation, or maybe some translators that might have been paid under the table to change some answers. The indigenous leaders in this group said, hey, you know what? We'll agree to your terms here, but we want to make sure that our people are going to be able to continue living their life the way that the creators led us here to do. That means we need to continue to be able to hunt and fish and gather and move about in a way that follows the patterns of change of the environment. And surprisingly, the United States reps here in this treaty signing did agree to that, to reserve the usufructuary rights of the indigenous folks through this treaty signing period. Article 11 is where it states it, and such of them as reside in the territory hereby ceded shall have the right to hunt and fish therein until otherwise ordered by the president. So the 54 treaty is one of a handful of treaties that were signed between the United States and indigenous folks here in the Western Great Lakes area that recognize some sort of usufructuary rights. Usufructuary is a term, it's a legal term, usually used in discussing mining issues. It means utilizing something that belongs to someone else. Oftentimes mining companies aren't necessarily mining from lands that they own. And so every treaty, all 4 of these treaties were written differently. If you have the chance and you're interested to go check them out. Flipbook is a great resource. Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission has all of those treaties listed on their website. We have the 54 treaty on our website. I have copies of it here today too, if you're interested in reading through it. But they all recognize those rights differently, a little different spin on them. It's not one phrase that is used throughout. The one thing that made the 54 treaty stand out from the other 3 in the area was that it also designated reservations within the Minnesota territory, northwestern Wisconsin, and the UP. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when you think about it, because these usufructuary rights recognized in Article 11 for those indigenous folks to be able to continue hunting, fishing, gathering. How are they supposed to move if the government is also at the same time putting them onto a reservation? Right? Even the Constitution of the United States government defines treaty agreements as the supreme law of the land. If there's a couple things that you guys can take away from this discussion today, I hope that it's recognizing the misconceptions about treaties and treaty rights within our neck of the woods. One of those being, many folks think that treaties are so old that they don't matter anymore, when in fact I did explain that these are very heavy land exchange agreements, or heavy and binding, and like I said before, hard to do away with. Things that are old doesn't mean that they're any less valuable. I try to tell them that to when I talk to 6th graders about treaty rights in their history classes, and we say it's old, that means it doesn't matter anymore. You're gonna tell that to your grandma, and they're like, oh, no, probably not. She makes really good cookies. So, you know, like I said, that Treaty of Paris, if we did away with that, how would we act differently in our life? How would it change things if we did away with that Treaty of Paris? I always tease and say things like, well, of course we'd drive on the other side of the road and answer to the king and eat bread pudding for breakfast. But seriously though, if we were gonna do away with this 1854 treaty, would these lands revert back to the tribes? Think of all the things in our life ways today because of that treaty. We want to go to a movie on Friday night. We want to tap dance on Friday night. We want to go on Tuesday lunch and learn about anything. It's all because of that treaty. I do need to make a key point that way back in 1905, I mean, I'm thinking this is like before the First World War. There's a Supreme Court case called the Winans case, where rights identified in treaty agreements were not a grant of rights to tribes, but a grant of rights from them. So this is what's called the reserved rights doctrine. And another thing that is a misconception amongst the public is that because treaty rights isn't well understood by the general public, or it might be a new concept, that the typical answer you get is, well, why do these Indian people get special rights? And treaty rights aren't necessarily special. They are unique. However, the right to hunt, fish, and gather was always the right of the bands since time immemorial. It was a right that they maintained through treaty signing, and it will be a right that they hold well into the future. Does that make sense? So now I need to dive into some federal court cases which really aided and supported in getting usufructuary rights recognized in the upper Midwest. And if you fall asleep, my apologies, I'll try to go through this fast. Uh-oh, I hope this worked. Cool. All right. The affirmation of treaty rights, these are the court cases that led to the affirmation of rights here. 1942, the Thule case that happened in the Pacific Northwest in the state of Washington. This case found treaty rights takes precedence over state law. If you think about it, the 54 treaty signing was between which independents, which sovereigns?
Federal government.
Federal government, United States, and indigenous folks, right? Chippewa or Ojibwe here, and where does the state fit in that relationship? The state is in fact a ward of the union. So they don't really have any place in that agreement. About 20 years later, and a little bit down the coast, the Bologna decision took place in Oregon in 1969, which found that the state is limited in its power to regulate Indian fisheries. The premise for this is that if you have the rights to harvest, you should have the rights to manage or protect or steward. And then a little bit closer to home, 1983, the Voight decision. It happened in Wisconsin between the Lacutere band, way up at the Supreme Court. So the Voight decision recognized usufructuary rights in the upper Midwest. So brought it a little bit closer to home to some of our relations. And specifically following that Voight decision, there was a lot of opposition taking the form of protests, particularly in northern Wisconsin. Do any of you guys remember this in the media, or maybe perchance you were there? It was ugly. And it's still happening today. So here's how I like to interpret the story. During the 70s and 80s, there was a movement called the American Indian Movement, where a lot of indigenous families were getting back to their traditional ways, their tribal roots. And one of those included ceremony. Another thing that included is traditional harvest. Walleye, oga, they come into the shallows to spawn right after ice out. You guys know walleye have reflective eyes. The way that spearing works in the springtime is that you go out with a torch, light of some sort in the front of your boat. You're able to see the females that come into the shallows, and you're able to spear them. You know what? Right after ice out, it doesn't always line up with when the fishing season opener happens, right? So there are a lot of other community members that saw fish being harvested from their lakes and saying, whoa, not cool. I'm a law-abiding citizen and this is happening. So there's a lot of consternation. I get it, I understand, because fishing is a very important part of our lives, everybody who lives here. So something had to be done. As this pertains to our history in 1854, the tribal leaders at Grand Portage got wind of what was going on down in Wisconsin, with people making headway towards trying to get their rights affirmed in Wisconsin bands. And there was a situation that happened in 1983, where there was a moose hunter who was harvesting on reservation. And how many hunters do we have in the room here? Okay. I love talking to like the 6th grade and the firearm safety kids about this. If you take your chance and take a shot at whatever game you're hunting, and you get a poor shot, or you get a good shot and they still run away, what is your duty as a hunter in that situation? Follow, right? blood trail, follow where we can, look, especially if that means going home with 400 pounds of moose meat. Yeah, that's not just gonna feed your family, that's gonna feed your community for a good portion of time. So this hunter took a shot, didn't have the best shot as a good hunter, followed his prey, followed his kill, couldn't find it. Ended up walking across state boundary, reservation boundary. Whereas he was stopped by a state game warden and cited for moose hunting out of season. And so the Grand Portage band decided to take on this suit and get those rights affirmed. So they filed with US District Court, and the other two bands holding treaty rights in the 54 joined that suit. And as they started down this road to proceeding with the process, the state of Minnesota stepped in. And they said, hey, guys, you know that the court systems take a long time and they're pretty pricey. How about we'll offer you a deal. If you agree to a few terms, of course we'll let you guys use your treaty rights. What that agreement included was there would have to be a development of a conservation code or rules and regulations to abide by while hunting, fishing, and gathering. There could be no commercial harvest and sale of game, fish or game. There could be no treaty season outside of state season, which means that fishing seasons have the same opener. Deer rifle season, same opener. There's cross deputization between game enforcement. So therefore, state wardens are able to cite both parties, tribal and non-tribal, pertaining to their particular code. As well as 1854 enforcement agents are able to charge both parties as well to their respective code. There also has to be an establishment of a judicial system when there's a violation of that code. And so the bands did agree to this, and which led to the formation of an organization called the Tri-Band Authority. We were charged with implementing this agreement. And Fond du Lac Band withdrew. To this day, they still handle protection and implementation of their own treaty rights. However, our biology wings both work together in a variety of ways. Things like that. Big game. And through the ages, it kind of called for a name change. Can't be called the Tri-Band Authority when you're only working for two bands. So we did become the 1854 Treaty Authority. We currently have 12 full-time employees throughout 4 different divisions. We function like a little mini DNR, but we have a lot more land and a lot more resources to deal with. So people often ask where we get our funding from, and 1978, there was the Bureau of Indian Affairs was tasked with, how do we say it? I don't know what, it's a policy period that came down in 1978. And the BIA was tasked with overseeing how this would roll out, the rights protection implementation for all of those bands and tribes within Indian country that do have reserved rights. They had to figure out a way for some allocation of funding to be spent on supporting management and supporting harvest and administrative costs for all making those programs happen. And so there are 5 Public Law 638 contractors, such as the 1854 Treaty Authority, us here working in the Upper Midwest, along with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. They work over in, they're located on the Bad River Reservation, but they work for about 13 different bands in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. There's Cora over here in Michigan, and they mainly work with the Ottawa bands that have offshore commercial harvest rights for the big lakes. And then 2 giant organizations that exist in the Pacific Northwest. From time to time, we hear things about salmon fisheries out there still. And there's still a lot of movement towards making those resources better, ecosystem connectivity, access to resources by not only the bands, but also the general public. Clear as mud, right? Yeah. Okay. I do need to make a note here that the 1854 Treaty Authority is not a special interest group. A lot of the time folks will hear our name and think, oh yeah, you're a tribal organization, kind of like Honor the Land. What was that? Is that the name of it? Honor the Earth, yeah, thank you. Yes, Honor the Earth. But in fact, we get our authority and jurisdiction through the Constitution of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, of which both of the bands we work for are members of. So therefore, we're a governmental entity. And therefore, we have, as I mentioned, judicial and regulatory authority over qualified band members and exercising those rights in the lands where they lie. So 1854 is really here. Our main role is to support our membership to pursue their subsistence harvest. And so we do this through a variety of ways. I'm going to kind of break this down, a couple of examples of how our programs function. And I think there's a small enough group of us. If you guys have questions, maybe we'll hold it to the end. I don't know. If it's a really burning question, go ahead and ask me. So how do we do this? How does implementation work on our end of things? Well, are those qualified band members, those who are enrolled, they have to have the right paperwork on hand to come to us and provide us with that paperwork to show that they are enrolled. We're able to turn around and provide them with an 1854 identification card. And that ID card goes, is utilized as a fishing license, a wild rice harvesting permit, a small game hunting license, and even acts as entry into the BWCA. Our board of directors is comprised of both tribal governments. They get together about every other month and they pass a lot of administrative policy and things. But they also have to approve bag limits and seasons every year for every harvest season. So that's what these look like. We also have to maintain our conservation code because of technological changes or other things that the state is doing that we want to make sure that we're being inclusive. A couple years ago, hunters started wearing blaze pink. We wanted to also give that opportunity to our constituency. So we changed that code to say, hey, you can wear blaze orange or blaze pink. Alternatively, things are getting safer. Firearms are getting more accurate. There's some things that need tweaking here and there. There's also changes in interest. For instance, like birch bark. I don't know if any of you have ever gone into the city to like a home goods store, but people love collecting birch bark and like putting them in their living room because they're white and they're stark and they're beautiful. But paper birch is not doing so hot with climate change. So we need to make sure that we have tabs on how and when and how far we're going to be protecting birch through this whole wave of hot birch harvesting. Also, myself with the Education and Outreach Division, as well as our conservation officers and enforcement, we are all certified instructors for firearm safety, ATV safety, snowmobile safety, as most of these activities are taking place in areas which are pretty remote. They're also taking place in times of year which are cold, right? So we talk hypothermia all the time. In our conservation code, we do state that any youth pursuing hunting have to have a firearm safety certificate. So that's what we do, put in those safety trainings a lot. Here's where I'll run down our organizational goals really quick. So goal 1, our purpose is to support member activities. Really, it's our bread and butter. So for instance, to set up a deer hunt, what does that entail? Well, we have to set up a permitting system, large game. We need to recognize and establish registration stations. We also need to communicate that information out to our constituency. So everything involved in that are some things that we do. Secondly, there's still a lot of interest and effort to diminish rights. That's why our staff attends a lot of meetings. We do a lot of letter writing to enable lands to stay in federal trust. Providing access. We don't want to take access away. Number 3. Resource management gets to do all the fun stuff. I'm a little bit jealous because I also studied ecology, and so I got to participate in a few of these programs over the years as well. But I want to touch on a few of them because they're cool. I do want to ask though, what good is it right if there are no resources, or if those resources are of such poor quality that they might inhibit human health? So this is where resource management, this is what drives our resource management to do what they do in terms of monitoring. And it's important to recognize that these trust resources are shared resources. And it's an obligation of the federal government to make sure that they will uphold this treaty agreement, this federal trust responsibilities. For those of us who also partake in enjoying the resources outside, you know, it's a shared resource, so we all have a responsibility in stewarding them. A couple of the programs that we do oversee, probably most culturally significant to the Bois, the Grand Portage band, is moose. And so we do play a role in the Minnesota Moose Survey, aerial annual survey up in the skies in January. Does anybody know why our wildlife biologist Morgan might only go up in January to do this survey? Why are they easier to see in January? The contrast?
There's much foliage.
So this is really surprising. I'm impressed that you guys, most of you are like, well, they're easier to see, their contrast, they're dark animals on a white background. If you're gonna have snow, which month is it gonna be? What would you expect? But a lot of the times we get folks saying, well, the leaves are down off the trees. That's why you're able to see them. There's no leaves to block your sight. When in fact it is actually because of the snow. Science doesn't have to be hard all the time. Like they're just easier to see. Okay. Probably most culturally significant to our Bois word band is Monoman. And we have a pretty extensive Monoman monitoring program that's been going on for over 20 years, looking at 10 rice waters specifically pretty intensely, and then also kind of assessing, surveying historical lakes and streams and rivers to make sure that if there is rice, could it be capable of hosting rice, things like that. We do participate with the Minnesota DNR in monitoring our walleye end of the year, electrofishing every year, and that's really fun to make sure that we're going to have a stable population throughout in the inland lakes. We have an environmental biology wing that does a lot of work in protecting the things that we can't necessarily see, air and water quality. We have an invasive species program that does a lot of work, not only with prevention, but also with control and monitoring as well. We live in a global society now, and things are just doing their job, and they hitchhike along with us on our boots or our trailers or whatever to distribute and migrate. And we enable that just with our life ways. So we do want to make sure that we're giving ample protection to those culturally significant species, those endemic species, by way of recognizing things that might inhibit them. Oh, this is a really cool story. I love a good restoration story. So this one took a really long time. Does anybody know what kind of fish this is? Yeah. Anybody know how to say it in Ojibwe? Name, who is that? Ah, right. No Mexico. Lake sturgeon were extirpated from the St. Louis River in the early 1900s. And being a culturally significant species, there was a lot of effort and interest to restore their populations, their breeding populations within the St. Louis River. And about 25 years ago, almost 30, Fond du Lac band working with Minnesota DNR, Wisconsin DNR, 1854 Treaty Authority, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started surveying and stocking little tiny sturgeon fry with the goal of trying to retain a reproducing population. And after 25 years, in which it takes a female sturgeon to become reproductively capable to adulthood, We're starting to see natural reproduction taking place in the St. Louis River as of about 5 years ago. I think that is the coolest thing. All right, and lastly, as I mentioned, being in a global society, we don't know what climate change is going to bring. But we want to make sure that we're preparing our communities to be adaptable to those changes and not put our eggs in the basket of things that are going to go away. So, lastly, last goal is the one that my division, education outreach, follows, and that's cultural preservation. We want to make sure that we do in fact have knowledgeable harvesters in our tribal youth and families in the communities that we serve. We have a website. We have 4 different social media platforms. I brought a couple copies of this today. It's a really extended version of our history. If anybody's interested, you can take a copy. It's also available on our website in an e-version. Some pictures from some of the youth programming that we've done over the past seasons. We took some of the kids out in American Indian Ed organizations with, American Indian Ed classes within the public schools in the area. We took them out to Wood Lake Spearing for Northern last year. It was super fun. Being a BWCA lake, we wanted to get further in, so we did hire dog sled team to take them out there, and we did have a lot of fish, and it was super fun. It's so cool. They had a blast. This is a couple of other activities that we've done over the years, also working with national parks in nearshore ecology education and how that plays into subsistence fisheries. This is a project we did with Grand Portage Band and Grand Portage National Monument alongside Isle Royale National Park. Okay, I want to say miigwech meet you and give you guys a few minutes to ask questions, and I'll do what I can to answer them. Hey.
I have a terminology.
Is it just repeat questions back to the Zoom crowd?
Absolutely, thank you.
I have a terminology question. Several of your slides referred to the Bois band as the band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And so sometimes I see that and sometimes not. Most recently, in this morning's Star Tribune, there was an article about the recent agreement between the Forest Service and 3 bands. And that article was at pains to distinguish between Fond du Lac and Grand Portage as Lake Superior, Chippewa, and Bois Forte is, I think, Minnesota Chippewa is the way they put it. Yeah.
So the question and statement, and you were most certainly correct, is that the name of the Bois Forte band does not include Lake Superior. Their actual governmental name is Bois Forte Band of Chippewa. This person recognized this in the Star Tribune write-up about the recent MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, that was signed between those 3 bands holding usufructuary rights and the U.S. Forest Service on the Superior National Forest. So thank you. That's an error in my part.
No, but that what's the difference? I mean, I realize the other 2 bands are closer to Lake Superior. Is it simply geographic proximity?
I don't have all the knowledge on this. What I do know is that us as United States citizens, if somebody were going to come here and say, oh, you guys are the United States instead of the United States of America, it's just a proper noun.
Okay.
And honestly, if you want to address somebody properly, use the proper noun. In terms of history and heritage and which peoples have associated with different locations, I'm sure an ethnographer or historian would be able to dive more deeply into that. That makes sense?
Yeah, it's probably just geographic proximity.
I mean, with Western settlement, I know that all of the treaty things and the push of people, the social coercion and things that made people move west. There were about 16 different bands that were pushed onto the Bois Forte reservation. We consider them today to be one band. So there's a lot of things in history that our United States history books don't account for. I can speak to language. I can speak to Ojibwe. I know that there's a different dialect spoken by people in the Border Lakes region. So Bois and Grand Portage. What are the two across the border? Croix and some folks in the Thunder Bay region. They speak a different dialect of Ojibwe than like Mille Lacs, for instance. I also know that in the treaty era, a lot of resources made reference to the Ojibwe of Lake Superior versus the Mississippian folks, which would have been more interior. So there's a lot of things going on. I can't necessarily answer all that. I mean, you can't just look at a map today and say, oh, well, whoever looks closer, because there's so much history behind it. That's a really good question and a very good distinction though. So thank you for being aware and questioning that. Very much. Who else we got? You over here.
When we are referring to the bands, the Bois band, the Fond du Lac band, how does that then fit into nations? I think of Arizona where there's the Navajo Nation. And I had a little trouble figuring out how the Anishinaabe have a nation. How does that work?
Sure. There are 7 Ojibwe or Anishinaabe groups in northern Minnesota. 6 of them belong to the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. Red Lake has a little different history with being terminated, so they kind of hold their own. But together, those 6 bands, Mille Lacs, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Bois, Forte, White Earth, and Leech Lake also form together as one tribe.
How does that differ from nations?
That's a great question. I think that's my own personal opinion. I have no idea, but I would say due to terminology within like the history of the United States, people documenting different things saying tribe. As most scholarly folks would recognize a group of people being a tribe, the term kind of stuck. I did get laughed at one time when I took a group of tribal youth out to Alaska, and they had a speaker there talking with us from a community. I don't remember which one it was. However, I said, which nation are you with? They asked her, like, just saying, which nation are you with, or where are you from? And she laughed at me because they don't say that in Alaska. They say, oh, I'm from Stevens Village. So ultimately, like, the geographic location represents their sovereign political identity, you know? So that's a good distinction. Another question I can't fully answer for you, but good to know.
4 years before the 1854 treaty, kind of a government authorized indirect massacre occurred called the Sandy Lake incident, where we're used to presidents that.
Can I give you the microphone for this? I think it's really important, especially for the people on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm just talking about an incident at Big Sandy Lake in 1850, which is kind of forgotten. And I wanted to know what effect that incident might have had on the Treaty of La Pointe, 1854. Governor Ramsey, who was really an Indian hater, as you may know, and a government Indian agent named John Watrous, backed up by, well, we're familiar with bad presidents, but Zachary Taylor was a piece of work, and he hated Indians too. They conspired to lure, and I think that's the right word, hundreds of the Lake Superior Ojibwe to Big Sandy Lake, stipulating that they had to bring their whole family with them, all the kids, everybody. And they were going to get treasures, food, cash, other goodies. It was late October, not a good time to be making long trips in the woods. They knew what would happen. And what happened was the goodies weren't there. They waited over a year, the goodies weren't there. All these members of the Lake Superior group wanted to go home. A lot of them headed home. November is not a good time to travel. When you're not prepared. And so 400 of them, about 12% of the Lake Superior Ojibwe perished. They tried, Governor Ramsey and his henchman, John Watros, the Indian agent, tried the same thing 2 years later. It didn't work out. What effect did that whole incident have on the 1854 treaty, or did it have an effect?
I just have to say, like, I am honored to be asked to speak to you guys because your cumulative knowledge beats me out of the water. Really, this is amazing, and I'm glad that you guys are able to draw on previous knowledge and ask these questions. So thank you. What effect did it have? Well, with that Sandy Lake tragedy, the annuity payments to the treaty bands, treaty signing bands, was always made at La Pointe, where they signed that treaty. And what changed in the Sandy Lake situation was that, we're gonna move the location for you guys. And again, communication without having high-speed internet. We don't know how many people got that message. And again, when folks did show up at Sandy Lake to receive their annuity payments, there was not anything yet, and they ended up waiting and waiting and waiting, whether it be planned or not. Does it have any, his question is, does it have any effect to the treaty as it stands today? Probably many, and I wish my colleague Eric Reddix were here because I know that he would know exactly what to say. I think they're following that situation. There was more demand and from the bands here in Minnesota to do things correctly the way that they had envisioned their treaty agreement would have meant. But did it happen? Not always. Alternatively, I do want to say, if anybody is interested in going to learn more about that piece of history at Sandy Lake, the Glickwick, or their sister organization, Wisconsin, they do hold a Sandy Lake Tragedy Memorial every year, in which case people paddle across Big Sandy Lake, and they have a feast and a ceremony on the other side, and it is open to the public. And it's really interesting to go and learn. I have attended it once or twice with my staff, and it's incredibly moving. It's also a lot of healing going on, so it can expose a lot of feelings, you know. Yeah, and that happens in like second week of July. If you'd be interested in attending, I'd say watch Glickwick's webpage. Thanks for bringing that up, though. Yes.
What are your thoughts about the current minimum of understanding?
My current thoughts. In terms of what?
Oh, just what you think about how this cooperation is being structured. It seems to me like it's long past due to get more authentic involvement with and from the tribes.
Sure.
So,
Honestly, I can't speak to it personally, like my personal feelings about it, because I'm standing here representing 1854. But I can tell you that in terms of memorandums of understanding, I'm a little bit more familiar with the MOU between the Leech Lake Band and the Chippewa National Forest than I am with this new one. I haven't had a chance to sit down and really digest it, nor have I been involved in the process as much as some of the other 1854 employees have been. So a lot of the times, whether they be governmental organizations or whatever, agencies, nonprofits, when they want involvement from the tribes, they're always coming to the tribes at the last minute. And Even our organization, you can see there's only 12 of us. So you need to kind of bring tribal folks along the process of your program, whatever you're trying to implement. There needs to be back and forth communication all the time. A lot of the time, these organizations working on projects say like, oh, well, I, dropped an email, nobody got back to me. That's because most of these employees are wearing 6 hats at one time when they're working for tribal government. You need to have a decent relationship. And that's why I'm really glad that 1854 and some of our colleagues with the Sovereignty Institute at University of Minnesota Duluth do what they do in overseeing training for state employees, following the mandate from the governor a few years back, that they go to these trainings and they understand, start to develop a relationship with the way of understanding of how these communities function, and looking at their responsibility in their own professional position to, road connectivity, the DOT, how is that working with when roads cross onto reservation boundaries, things like that. And that covers every agency within the state. But MOU, so after this problem of consultation, instead of coming to the band at the last minute when you're wanting to get something pushed through, there needs to be a movement towards better communication and a better format and ways to do that. I think it's right in line with what we know of the Bologna decision in 1969, where the rights to harvest meant the rights to manage. And I think co-management is the next step. And certainly it has been a long time coming. Our sister organization in Wisconsin and the UP have other MOUs that were previously signed with Hiawatha, the Ottawa, the Chippewa National Forest. Those are already, well in hindsight. So I'm happy to see it through. And that reminds me, I have homework to do. I have to sit down to read it. Hang on a second. You had one question over here. Yeah.
I remember when the Wisconsin protests were occurring. Well, unfortunately, our beloved Viking coach, Bud Grant, put his name out there. I assume that most of the, all the terrible things that were going to happen, there'd be no fish left for the rest of us, all that kind of stuff, didn't happen. I mean, not even all, I read the paper, not all the band members go walleye fishing, so considering that, all the terrible things that were going to happen really didn't happen, why are there still people protesting? Is it just they're just against Indians getting all these special deals, or what's going on with protest in Wisconsin?
And in Minnesota too. I mean,
Minnesota too?
it's ignorance. And that's why I do what I do. So you guys can take this home and hopefully make some changes. I hope to provide you with the background, understanding the history, as well as like the policy that have outlined how treaty rights are implemented and managed today. There's not a bunch of people just running around the woods taking whatever they want. Right? So. Yeah. Good point.
I have a question about this data collection of like moose and minnow and like fisheries. Do you share that with other agencies, or is it just kind of all internal?
So that's a really great question. It was the data collected from resource management monitoring activities. Is that information available to the public, or which organizations and agencies might it be shared with? Obviously, our partners as their shared resources. So Department of Natural Resources and some federal agencies as well. There is a big movement towards protection of indigenous data and how that's used and how it's implemented, who gets a hold of it. And many of the projects that we're starting to work with now, the rights to owning that data has gone to the bands and the tribes. But surprisingly, 54 is their shared resources. Treaty rights, it happens on places where there's settlement, right? So more parties have access to harvest of these resources. Therefore, we do make our resource management reports available to the public. You can find all of our information on biological monitoring on our website. And every program that we have has a report due every year based on their grant funding and through the BIA and whatnot, but, okay. But yeah, if you guys wanna check it out, check out our website. I had one more question and then I'm gonna wrap it up. If you guys wanna speak with me afterwards, I am more than welcome to chat with you. You had one hand up over
I
here.
just wanted to make a clarification for Betty's question. At the open house at the Forest Service last week. At the open house for the Forest Service last week, I talked with Juan Martinez. And he's the liaison between the Forest Service and the bands. And he made it clear that while the meetings with the bands used to occur once a year, they're now mandated to occur once a month. And then his word was, we are not expecting to make any land decisions until those conversations with the bands have happened. So that was the perspective that he put forward. Let's hope that that's it, and you know, that there is further communication and clear communication prior to making any changes or decisions.
Great. You wanna say anything?
And that's all for me. Maybe let's meet you. I'm gonna set out some resources for you guys in the back.
All right, thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.